Most people, if they know anything about Britain's relationship with Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries, know this version of events. A great empire extended its administrative hand across North Africa, built railways and irrigation works, reformed a chaotic system of governance, and eventually, after a long and patient tutelage, granted independence to a nation that had been prepared for self-rule. The story is told in the language of order restored and modernity delivered. It appears in British parliamentary records, in the memoirs of the men who administered it, and in the history textbooks that transmitted their account to subsequent generations. What that story omits, with a consistency that begins to look less like oversight and more like institutional practice, is the financial architecture that made the entire arrangement possible, and the identities of the parties who collected on it. Britain did not seize Egypt in 1882 because a nationalist uprising threatened the Suez Canal, though that uprising existed, and the canal mattered to British imperial communications. Britain seized Egypt because Egypt owed money. Enormous sums to European bondholders, to French banking houses, to British financial institutions whose names appear in the subscription lists of Egyptian government bonds issued through the 1860s and 1870s. The men who held those bonds had concluded, after Egypt formally suspended payment on its external debt in 1876, that the only reliable mechanism for protecting their investment was to install, in Cairo, someone with a mandate to collect. The military expedition was the enforcement instrument. The financial system it protected was the actual objective. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What followed was administered through a single British official stationed in Cairo. Not a governor, not a viceroy, not a colonial administrator who carried a title that acknowledged what his function actually was. His designation was Consul General. His actual authority extended across every significant department of the Egyptian government, through a network of British advisors placed in each ministry whose reports traveled upward to him rather than to their nominal Egyptian superiors. For 40 years, the finances of a sovereign state, its tax rates, its debt service schedule, its public expenditure allocations, its monetary policy, were directed from a residency on the banks of the Nile by a succession of British officials who described what they were doing as advice. The Egyptian population that paid the taxes funding those decisions called it occupation. The bondholders in London and Paris whose returns depended on those decisions called it security. To understand how Egypt reached that position, the record must begin not in 1882, but roughly 2 decades earlier, in the period when the Ottoman province of Egypt began borrowing from European capital markets at a scale its revenue base could not sustain. Egypt in the 1850s and 1860s was, by the standards of its region, an ambitious administrative unit undertaking an accelerated program of modernization. The Khedives, the hereditary governors who administered Egypt under nominal Ottoman suzerainty, were building railways, extending telegraph lines, expanding the irrigation infrastructure of the Nile Delta, and increasing the area under cotton cultivation for export to European textile markets. Ismail Pasha, who became Khedive in 1863 and who pressed this program with particular intensity, operated in a period when the revenue case for his borrowing appeared solid. The American Civil War had disrupted global cotton supply with dramatic effect. Egyptian cotton, flooding into markets previously served by American plantations, commanded prices that generated revenues which, on a pro forma projection, appeared capable of servicing the debt that Ismail was accumulating. The projections were wrong. The cotton boom ended when American production resumed after the war. The debt remained. Between 1862 and 1875, Egypt's external debt grew from approximately 3 million Egyptian pounds to a figure approaching 100 million. The loan instruments through which this debt was created were structured in ways that the European banking syndicates arranging them understood with precision, and that Ismail's government, operating without any institutional tradition of sovereign debt management or any legal framework for evaluating the terms being offered, was in no position to contest effectively. Loans were issued at a discount. Egypt would contract to repay £100 for every 70 or 75 it actually received, and the nominal interest rate therefore understated the effective cost of the capital by a margin that was not incidental. It was the source of the arranger's profit. The banking houses in London and Paris that structured these instruments captured the spread between the nominal rate Egyptian officials signed for and the effective yield that European investors paid to acquire the bonds in the secondary market. The Khedive received the proceeds. The bondholders received the return. The population of Egypt, whose labor and agricultural production would generate the tax revenue to service the obligation, received neither. By 1875, the gap between Egypt's debt service obligations and its actual revenue had become arithmetically irreducible. Ismail had been rolling over short-term obligations to service longer-term ones, borrowing at increasing cost as creditor confidence deteriorated, and the fiscal position had reached the point where no further extension was possible. In November of that year, he sold the Egyptian government's entire shareholding in the Suez Canal Company, approximately 44% of the total equity, to the British government for £4 million. The transaction was arranged by the Rothschild banking house in London, which provided the purchase price to Benjamin Disraeli's government on a bridging basis, at interest, while parliamentary authorization for the expenditure was obtained retrospectively. Britain acquired a controlling interest in the most strategically significant waterway on Earth, at a price that reflected Egypt's desperation rather than the asset's value. Disraeli described the acquisition to Queen Victoria as a great achievement for England. The ledger entry that recorded what Egypt received for it was rather more modest. The canal sale bought months rather than years. By 1876, Egypt had formally suspended payment on its external debt. The response from France and Britain, the two powers with the largest institutional exposure to Egyptian default, was immediate and architecturally precise. They established, by agreement with the Khedival government, a body called the Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Commission of the Public Debt, whose function was to manage Egypt's financial obligations on behalf of the creditor community. The Caisse was not an advisory institution in any sense that carried real content. It held legal authority, confirmed by international treaty, over specific and substantial streams of Egyptian revenue, the railways, the port of Alexandria, the tobacco concession, and several categories of direct taxation. These revenue streams were ring-fenced by the treaty establishing the Caisse, dedicated to debt service before a single pound could be directed to any function of the Egyptian state. The government's schools, its courts, its irrigation administration, its public health provision, everything was funded from whatever remained after the Caisse had collected what the bondholders were owed. This arrangement, which its architects described as a temporary emergency measure to restore Egyptian creditworthiness, established the basic financial structure that would govern Egypt for the next 4 decades. The military occupation of 1882 did not create it. The occupation secured it against the possibility that an Egyptian political movement might dismantle what the treaty had constructed. The uprising that prompted the British landing was led by Ahmed Urabi, an army colonel whose movement drew its support from Egyptian officers, landowners, and members of the educated urban population who had watched the joint Anglo-French financial administration, the dual control, as it was called after 1879, systematically extract the revenue that might otherwise have funded Egyptian institutional development. Urabi's argument was political in its framing and financial in its substance, that Egypt was being administered for the benefit of foreign creditors rather than for its own population, and that the Khedival government had surrendered sovereignty over its own finances in exchange for a continuation of its dynasty's political position. His analysis of the mechanism was accurate. Britain and France chose to address it militarily rather than engage with it. France, for reasons of domestic parliamentary calculation, declined to participate in the military action when it came. Britain acted alone. In July of 1882, the Royal Navy bombarded Alexandria. In September, British forces under General Wolseley defeated Urabi's army at Tel el-Kebir and entered Cairo. The campaign lasted weeks. The financial administration it inaugurated lasted 40 years. Evelyn Baring arrived in Cairo in 1883 as Her Majesty's agent and consul general. He was 42 years old, had served in Egypt previously during the dual control period, and understood the debt structure and the Caisse mechanism with the detailed technical knowledge of someone who had watched it operate from the inside. He also understood what his actual function was, even when his public communications consistently described it otherwise. His mandate was to restore Egyptian financial credibility, which meant, in operational terms, ensuring that the revenue streams dedicated to debt service continued to flow to the Caisse without interruption, while managing Egyptian public expenditure within whatever margin remained after that prior claim had been met. The instrument through which Baring administered this mandate was the network of British advisors placed in the Egyptian ministries of Finance, Public Works, Interior, and Justice. These officials held Egyptian ministerial titles or advisory designations. Their actual authority flowed from Baring, not from the Egyptian ministers nominally above them in the administrative hierarchy. Egyptian ministers who disputed the advice they were given found that the dispute traveled upward, to Baring, to the Foreign Office in London, and if necessary to the diplomatic pressure that Britain could bring to bear on the Khedive's continued position. The advice was, in practice, instruction that could not be refused without consequences that the Khedival court was not willing to accept. Baring's financial administration produced outcomes that its public documentation describes as reform and that the financial record shows as extraction conducted with administrative precision. The corvée, the system of forced unpaid peasant labor that had been used to maintain Egypt's irrigation infrastructure, was abolished during the early years of the occupation. This reform was genuine, and its humanitarian dimension was real. It also aligned precisely with the financial objective. Peasant labor freed from corvée obligation was peasant labor available for cotton cultivation, which generated the export revenue that funded the tax base from which debt service was paid. The reform and the extraction were not in tension. They were designed to reinforce each other. The cotton economy that Baring promoted and expanded through improvements to the Nile irrigation system was an economy organized around a single commodity whose price was set on markets in Liverpool and Alexandria, over which Egypt exercised no influence. The irrigation improvements were funded by borrowing, new loans added to the accumulated debt, which increased the productive capacity of the land, while simultaneously enlarging the obligations that productive capacity was required to service. The Caisse maintained its prior claim on designated revenues throughout this period. The Egyptian state was funded from the surplus after that claim was met. In years of poor harvest or depressed cotton prices, the surplus was narrow, and Egyptian public expenditure was compressed accordingly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The compression fell most heavily on Egyptian education. At the time of the British occupation in 1882, Egypt maintained a system of government schools that served a meaningful portion of the urban population and had been expanded during the reform period of the 1860s and early 70s. The financial regime of the Baring years cut the education budget repeatedly through the 1880s and 1890s, as the requirements of debt service constrained available revenue. Baring's own annual reports acknowledged the underfunding while consistently maintaining that the financial position left no alternative. By 1907, when Baring departed Egypt after 24 years in Cairo, the country's literacy rate had not materially improved from its level when the occupation began, despite a substantial increase in the Egyptian population. The mechanism that produced this outcome was not administrative neglect. It was the systematic prioritization of creditor returns over any public expenditure that could not be directly connected to the production of export revenue. The men who held Egyptian bonds during the Baring period were not individually visible in the public record of British policy toward Egypt. The institutional holders, the investment trusts, the insurance companies, the private banking houses of the City of London maintained representatives who corresponded with the British Foreign Office and whose interests were weighted in the calculations that Baring and his advisors made. That correspondence survives in the Foreign Office archives. It is detailed and specific about the financial requirements of the creditor community, and it is largely absent from the parliamentary debates and press accounts of the occupation that circulated in Britain during this period. The public case for maintaining the British presence in Egypt was consistently political. The Suez Canal, regional order, the protection of minorities, the eventual preparation of Egypt for self-government. The financial case was conducted between institutions that communicated in private and did not require the public record to coordinate their understanding. By the early 1900s, Egypt's debt position had improved substantially. The agricultural expansion of the Baring period, combined with the reduction of the nominal debt burden through consistent service payments, had brought the ratio of debt to revenue to a level that the international credit markets regarded as manageable. The Entente Cordiale of 1904, the diplomatic agreement between Britain and France that resolved several colonial disputes, included a reorganization of the Egyptian financial arrangements. France surrendered its formal claims through the Caisse mechanism in exchange for British acquiescence in French dominance of Morocco. The Egyptian government was not a party to this exchange. Its financial arrangements were transferred between the two European powers as a diplomatic asset in a broader settlement. The Caisse de la Dette Publique was modified rather than dissolved. Britain's position in Egypt was confirmed internationally in exchange for French freedom of action elsewhere on the continent. The formal Protectorate Declaration of 1914, which accompanied the Ottoman entry into the First World War and required Britain to regularize its Egyptian position, made explicit what had been administratively true since 1882. The Consul General became a High Commissioner. The Ottoman suzerainty that had provided a legal fiction of Egyptian independence was severed. The Khedive was replaced by a sultan who was more clearly a British client. The financial administration that had operated through the mechanism of advice and the parallel authority of British ministry advisors was now embedded in a structure that acknowledged its own nature rather than perpetually deferring to a fiction. The admission that the occupation's primary function had been financial rather than administrative appeared gradually in the published record, and from sources whose institutional position gave them authority to speak and reason to minimize. Lord Cromer, the title conferred on Evelyn Baring after his departure from Egypt, published his account of the occupation in 1908. The work was 2 volumes, widely reviewed and respectfully received in Britain. In it, Cromer was explicit on several points that his official communications during the occupation period had carefully avoided: the priority of debt service requirements in shaping Egyptian public expenditure decisions, the deliberate subordination of Egyptian educational development to financial constraints, the impossibility of extending Egyptian administrative autonomy while the Caisse maintained its prior claim on Egyptian revenue. He presented these priorities as having been correct given the circumstances. He did not present them as having been obscured, though the parliamentary speeches, press communications, and public correspondence of the occupation period had consistently described British policy in terms of reform, administrative improvement, and the patient work of preparing Egypt for eventual self-governance, rather than in terms of the debt service schedules that actually governed the allocation of Egyptian revenue. The Egyptian nationalist Mustafa Kemal, who worked throughout the last decade of his short life, he died in 1908 at 34, to build international support for Egyptian independence, had made precisely this argument in forums that British officials were positioned to hear and chose not to engage. His analysis of the Caisse mechanism, his documentation of the relationship between debt service requirements and the underfunding of Egyptian public institutions, and his argument that no administrative reform could constitute genuine self-government while the financial architecture of creditor priority remained in place, these were presented in Egyptian newspapers, in correspondence with European governments, and in public speeches in Cairo and abroad. British official communications of the period described him as an emotional agitator. His financial analysis was not refuted in any official document. It was simply not acknowledged as the kind of argument that required engagement from the kind of institution that the British administration in Egypt considered itself to be. The long consequence that the financial architecture of the occupation produced is traceable not primarily in the debt figures, which were eventually retired, but in the structural patterns it established in the Egyptian economy and in Egyptian state capacity. The cotton monoculture that Baring developed as the engine of debt service created a dependency on a single export commodity whose price Egypt could not set, whose cultivation required continuous irrigation investment that the Egyptian government was never given the resources to fund from domestic revenue, and whose returns flowed disproportionately to landowners and to the European trading and financial intermediaries who organized the export market. When cotton prices collapsed in the years following the First World War, Egypt had no diversified industrial or manufacturing base to absorb the shock. The investment that might have built one had been remitted to London and Paris for 4 decades in the form of bond interest and principal repayment. The productive capacity of the Egyptian agricultural system, enlarged substantially under British administration, generated returns that were captured outside Egypt in proportions that the Caisse mechanism had been specifically designed to guarantee. The institutional legacy was equally durable. The practice of embedding foreign advisors in Egyptian ministries, advisors whose reports traveled upward to the British residency rather than to their nominal Egyptian superiors, and whose preferences overrode Egyptian ministerial judgment whenever the two diverged, established an administrative pattern in which the formal structure of Egyptian governance operated in the presence of a parallel authority whose preferences were dispositive. The pattern persisted in modified forms after the formal British withdrawal, reproduced in the relationships between successive Egyptian governments and the international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, that conditioned their financial support on Egyptian policy choices specified in advance and monitored by resident representatives. The Caisse de la Dette Publique was dissolved. The principle it embodied, that creditor claims on sovereign revenue are prior to the expenditure decisions of the government that represents the population generating that revenue, was not dissolved. It was institutionalized in successor bodies, with broader mandates and more neutral-sounding names. What the financial record of the British occupation of Egypt shows, placed beside the official account of administrative reform and imperial stewardship, is 4 decades of financial extraction conducted through an institutional architecture designed to be invisible in its operation while being entirely legible in its outcomes. The men who built and administered that architecture were not concealing a crime in any sense that the law of their period would have recognized. They were managing a capital interest with the instruments available to sovereign states and financial institutions in the late 19th century, in a period when the direction of sovereign fiscal policy through military occupation was a recognized, if rarely publicly stated, feature of the international financial order. The concealment was not of the mechanism itself. The Caisse was a public institution, its revenues were published in official reports, its authority was confirmed by international treaty, but of the priority. The consistent, documented, institutionally enforced subordination of Egyptian public need to European creditor return was conducted behind a language of advice, civilization, and patient reform that the British administration in Egypt had every institutional reason to maintain, and that the creditor community it served had every financial reason not to correct. The bonds have been paid. The system that serviced them is recognizable in the institutions that followed it, and the accounting of what the arrangement actually cost the population that generated the revenue which made it possible has never been produced by any institution that was positioned to produce it, because the production of that accounting was never among the functions those institutions were designed to perform. The financial architecture that Cromer built did not end when Cromer left. It survived his three immediate successors, each of whom inherited the same structural mandate even as the language used to describe their office grew more candid. Sir Eldon Gorst, who took over as Consul General in 1907, attempted a modest loosening of the advisory system, restoring some decision-making authority to Egyptian ministers in departments with limited fiscal weight. The experiment was narrow by design. Gorst never touched the finance ministry, the one department whose independence would have meant something, because the finance ministry was the department through which the Caisse's prior claim was administered, and no British official in this period was prepared to test what would happen to Egyptian bond prices if that claim were placed in Egyptian hands. Kitchener, who succeeded Gorst in 1911, reversed the loosening entirely and reasserted the older pattern of direct British control across every ministry that touched revenue or expenditure. He left Egypt in 1914 to become Britain's Secretary of State for War, a position from which the Egyptian Treasury no longer required his direct attention, though the structure he had reinforced continued to operate without him. The war years hardened the arrangement further. Egypt, now formally a protectorate, was made to fund a substantial share of the British military presence stationed on its soil, ostensibly to defend the Suez Canal against Ottoman attack. Egyptian taxpayers paid for barracks, for requisitioned livestock, for the forced labor of the newly reconstituted Camel Transport Corps and the Egyptian Labor Corps, hundreds of thousands of men conscripted to serve behind Allied lines in Palestine and France. None of this labor and none of this expenditure appeared as a line item that Egyptian representatives had approved, because no Egyptian representatives existed with the authority to approve or withhold it. The financial claim that had begun as a mechanism for collecting on 19th-century bonds had, by 1918, expanded to include the direct financing of a European war that Egypt had not chosen and from which Egypt derived no benefit that any Egyptian ministry was permitted to calculate. It was against this accumulated weight that the rebellion of 1919 erupted. When Saad Zaghloul, the leader of the WAF delegation that sought to present Egypt's case for independence at the Paris Peace Conference, was arrested and deported to Malta in March of that year, the response was immediate and nationwide. Strikes closed the railways that the Caisse had once held as security. Demonstrations filled the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and towns throughout the Delta that had spent 4 decades generating the cotton revenue on which the entire financial structure depended. British officials described the uprising, in communications to London, primarily as a security problem requiring military suppression. The economic content of the grievance, the same content Mustafa Kemal had documented a decade earlier, received far less attention in the official telegrams than the question of how quickly order could be restored along the rail lines that moved Egyptian cotton to Alexandria for export. London dispatched Lord Milner to investigate, and the commission that bore his name spent months touring Egypt, interviewing officials and compiling a report that, when it was finally submitted in 1920, recommended an end to the Protectorate in favor of a treaty relationship that would preserve British control over specific reserved matters. Foreign policy, the defense of Egypt against external threats, the protection of foreign interests and minorities, and the administration of the Sudan were named explicitly as areas Britain intended to retain. What the report did not name explicitly, though its implications were understood by every financial institution with a stake in the outcome, was the fate of the debt arrangements that the Caisses had been built to enforce. The unilateral declaration of Egyptian independence that Britain issued in February of 1922, ending the formal protectorate while reserving those 4 categories of continued control, left the underlying financial relationship essentially untouched. Egypt received a king, a parliament, and a constitution. It did not receive control over the Suez Canal Company, over the substantial foreign-held share of its own agricultural land, or over the debt servicing apparatus that had been refined and consolidated across 4 decades of occupation. The nominal independence granted in 1922 proved durable in form and hollow in substance for a further 3 decades. British troops remained garrisoned along the canal. British financial and commercial interests retained the preferential position that the Caisse and its successor arrangements had secured, embedded in the country's fiscal bloodstream through the Suez Canal Company's revenue, through British-held agricultural land, and through commercial treaties that no Egyptian government had freely chosen. The Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 narrowed the British military presence to the Canal Zone and formally ended the residual capitulatory privileges that had shielded foreign nationals from Egyptian law, but it did not touch the ownership structure of the canal itself. The institution whose original 44% share purchase in 1875 had opened this entire financial chapter. That ownership question would not be resolved until 1956, when Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company outright, a decision that provoked a military response from Britain, France, and Israel, precisely because the canal's revenue stream still mattered enormously to institutions in London and Paris that had never stopped regarding it as theirs by right, whatever the Treaty of 1888 governing international navigation of the waterway actually said about sovereignty. What connects the bond default of 1876 to the tanks that rolled toward Port Said in 1956 is not coincidence, and it is not simply the recurring strategic value of a canal. It is the persistence across 3/4 of a century of an assumption embedded so deeply in British financial and diplomatic culture that it rarely required explicit statement that revenue-generating assets acquired by European capital in the Eastern Mediterranean, however that acquisition had occurred, constituted a category of property that indigenous political sovereignty was not permitted to disturb. The Caisse de la Dette Publique had established the operating principle in 1876. The Suez Crisis of 1956 tested whether that principle still held 80 years later, after 2 world wars, after the formal end of the Protectorate, after decades of Egyptian nationalist politics had made the argument publicly and repeatedly that Egyptian resources belonged to Egyptians. Britain and France discovered, in the diplomatic humiliation that followed their failed invasion, that the assumption no longer held, not because the underlying financial logic had changed, but because the United States, which had inherited global financial leadership from a Britain that the 2 world wars had exhausted, declined to extend the credit and diplomatic cover that the operation required. The archival record of this entire sequence is not hidden in any technical sense. The Foreign Office correspondence, the Caisse's annual reports, Cromer's own published volumes, the Milner Commission's findings, and the treaty texts of 1922 and 1936 all sit in accessible archives and university libraries, available to any researcher with the time to assemble them. What has proven durable is not secrecy but framing. The documents describe debt service schedules and advisory appointments in the dry technical language of 19th century public finance, and that language does not translate easily into the narrative form through which most people encounter history, the story of empire as a project of governance rather than a project of collection. A textbook chapter has room for the drama of Tel el-Kebir. It rarely has room for the discount rate on an 1868 Egyptian bond issue, even though that discount rate explains far more about what followed than the battle does. The pattern that the Egyptian case establishes is not unique to Egypt, and it did not end with Egyptian independence in any of its stages. Sovereign default, followed by externally supervised fiscal reconstruction, in which the supervising authority answers to the creditor community rather than to the population whose taxes fund the settlement, recurs across the 20th century in forms that carry different institutional names and operate under different legal instruments, while preserving the same essential relationship. The receivership imposed on the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, the year before the Egyptian occupation, followed a nearly identical template and drew on many of the same European financial institutions. The dollar diplomacy customs receiverships that the United States imposed on the Dominican Republic and Haiti in the early 20th century reproduced the structure with an American rather than a European creditor class. The structural adjustment programs that the International Monetary Fund attached to sovereign lending in the final decades of the 20th century operated through conditionality agreements rather than resident advisors with ministerial authority, but the underlying principle that the terms of a state's fiscal policy could be specified in advance by an external body answerable to its creditors and monitored for compliance, is the same principle the Caisse de la Dette Publique institutionalized in Cairo in 1876. Egypt was not an isolated case. It was an early and unusually well-documented instance of a mechanism that international finance would refine and redeploy for the following century and beyond. None of this is presented to suggest that the men who built the case, who staffed the Cairo residency, or who held Egyptian bonds in London and Paris, were unusual in their period for prioritizing return over responsibility to a population they did not represent. They were operating within a financial and legal order in which sovereign debt was treated as a claim that superseded the ordinary operation of self-government whenever the two came into conflict, and in which the enforcement of that claim through military and administrative means carried no meaningful international constraint. What the Egyptian record shows is not an aberration in how 19th century imperial finance worked. It is a demonstration, unusually well preserved in the archive, of how it was designed to work from the outset. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.